The adventure begins.
Hopefully, the weather's good.
We're taking off from Wiley's this morning. It's about 9:30. This is a video log of a trip that Doug Keller and I made close to 10 years ago. This particular Super Cub was stretched, I believe 8 inches, had larger tail feathers, 180 horse with a 90-inch prop, had a 3/4 of an inch bump up on the angle of incidence, and it was a real performer.
We made it!
We ended up having a delayed departure because of weather, and I don't think we got left until about 9:30. And we headed for Kenmore Air for our first fuel stop. After Kenmore Air, we departed Kenmore Air with our flight plan for clearing customs in Vancouver. And we landed Vancouver, cleared customs, went pretty smoothly. From there, we flew pretty much direct through BC to Nimpo Lake. Nimpo Lake was our first destination. A friend of ours, John Klopek, who owned the Stinson that you'll see in this video, had made this trip a number of times and invited us along. Okay, folks, this is what it's all about. Both Doug and I were fairly new to float plane flying. Or I should back up. Doug had done float plane flying in the past, but didn't have a lot of time in this airplane. And I had only gotten my float plane certificate probably 10 years prior, so I had probably 10 hours total time. The idea was Doug and I would share the flying and split the expenses, and we'd all have a good time. We spent the first night at Nimpo Lake in a cabin, got up bright and early the next morning, and departed for Turner Lake. At Turner, we spent the night there, did a little fishing, a little sightseeing, a little hiking, and the next day from Turner, we departed for, I believe it was Mary's Lake, might have been Mary's cabin. Anyway, we ended up at this little cabin on this lake. It's the only cabin on the lake. All hand built from logs that were Scandinavian coped, I believe. We spent the night there in that cabin, and one of my memories of spending the night in the cabin was there wasn't a lot of space for beds, so I think Doug took the loft and John took the bed on the main floor, and that left me sleeping on a thermarest pad on the floor. And about midnight, I felt something crawling on me. And I was like, what the heck? Grabbed my headlamp and turned on my headlamp, and all these mice just scurried. From that point on, I didn't sleep very good the rest of that night. I've always loved float planes and the world that they open up to a pilot. You think about it, and our land is covered with a lot of water, so it opens up a whole new area for us to explore. Same with skis. Skis are almost in a class by themselves because now when there's snow on the ground, everything becomes a potential landing site. But back to the floats. The floats are almost a romantic type of flying. I remember getting my float plane rating. Just the smell of the engine on the water, for some reason, whenever I get in a float plane, it just brings back fond memories. And it's just the smell of the, I guess, exhaust coming up off the water. But when the doors open and I smell that smell, it just takes me back. There's only a few people that I feel totally at ease in an airplane with when I'm not the pilot. Doug is one of those people, and I trust him with my life. I can't say the same for other people I've ridden with. I wouldn't hesitate to stick my family in the airplane with him. I choose who I ride with in small airplanes, which may sound different since I go into crazy places by myself all the time, but I guess you would say I'm somewhat of a control freak. Over the years, I've ridden with really good pilots and I've ridden with really bad pilots, and you can tell the good ones right away. They have the confidence, they're smooth, they're not agitated, they're not easily shaken, and they can look at a spot and not have to guess whether they can land it or not. Even though Doug was new to this airplane, he still had the confidence, and I believed in his confidence. Maybe I was somewhat blind to whatever dangers lurked out there, but I still believed that everything would be just fine with him piloting. I do believe that a person needs to pick very wisely who they hop in an airplane with. I'm constantly amazed at people that are ready to hop in my airplane and go for a ride and not really know my capabilities. One of the things I don't think a lot of people realize is there's not wildlife around every corner. You may fly for hundreds of miles and not see anything. And then you might be flying along and all of a sudden there's just wildlife everywhere. You know, there's a stretch of beach that I usually fly going up to Alaska, and I can pretty much count on seeing half a dozen bears, grizzly bears. But then you might not see another grizzly bear for 500 miles, 1,000 miles, 5 days. So they are in concentrated areas. Typically, there's a reason that those animals are there. When you're moose hunting, you know, you're looking for moose. When you're bear hunting, you're looking for bear. And when you're sheep hunting, you're looking for sheep. And they all kind of have their own areas that you would spot them uniquely in. You're going to look for sheep up high and moose typically down lower in the valleys or out in the swampy tundra. Without a doubt, airplanes have opened up a world of adventure for me, a world that most people never get a chance to see. I was fortunate enough to find flying fairly young in life. I got my pilot's license when I was around 30 years old, and so I've been flying since 1994, and allowed me to build my experience over time. An interesting piece of trivia, I've gone back to Google Earth to look over all the places that we were at. And these glaciers that Doug's taxiing along and taking off and landing next to are completely gone. They've receded back to the point that you wouldn't even see them. From Mary's cabin, the next day, we took off and did some more sightseeing with the float plane. John tagged along with his Stinson. Actually, I think he was showing us the way, but the capabilities of the Super Cub shone through pretty quickly that he could go, the Super Cub, Doug, could go where the Stinson could not. And we ended up on this larger glacial fed lake. And you can see John landing his Stinson here. And you can see that, it burns up a lot of space. From that point, we did a little sightseeing on this lake. I don't think we actually got out. We just motored around the glacier, took off again. Doug spotted a smaller lake down below that he wanted to land. He thought it'd be some neat pictures and, some interesting glacial viewing. So we took off, Doug and I, and his Cub, and we landed down at this next lake. And we got out, and I pulled my HD video camera out, and I videotaped a fairly long segment of Doug doing takeoff and landings. John hiked down from the bigger lake to the smaller lake, I believe it was, which was about a mile hike. And so he joined us there. So we think we're all by ourselves. We have this beautiful glacier all to ourselves. And as Doug is doing his first landing, as I've set up the camera, I am distracted by this helicopter coming in. And I'm thinking to myself, well, is he sightseeing or is he, a Canadian authority and we're doing something we shouldn't be doing? Anyway, there's a lot of stuff going through my mind. As it turns out, this is a paid scenic flight tour, and his clients are catered to with wine and cheeses and meat platter, and we continue to do our thing and they do their thing.
Well, these guys don't even get out.
Maybe you're not allowed to.
They're preparing the paperwork. Here, take a picture of them.
That is a sweet. That's cool. Fun. I'm gonna send that picture to Paul.
So Doug makes a reference to sending the picture to Paul. Most people wouldn't know who Paul is, so I'll tell you a little bit about Paul. Paul owns Ultima Thule Lodge in the Wrangell St. Elias National Park. It is probably one of the most spectacular places you could ever go. So when we go out on adventures and see neat things, that's kind of the standard that we use for setting what's very, very on the upper end of cool, the cool factor. As Doug's doing his takeoff and landings along this big tall glacier, which is probably 3 or 4 stories high, we don't really consider the possibilities that this is a moving glacier, that it could calve at any time. And because we're pretty much oblivious to it, Doug is making these takeoff runs right down along the edge of it with this big 90-inch prop hitting the speed of sound. And fortunately, this glacier stays solid and never calves on us. But as you'll see from these pictures coming up, these are some pictures of an incident that Bobby Breeden and his father, Bob Breeden, had in Alaska. And they got tangled up with a glacier that was calving. And this is what their airplane looked like before this happened. And then you'll see 4 pictures of what the airplane looked like several days after the glacier had chewed it up. If I had never seen these pictures, I would probably not still know the dangers of doing what Doug and I were doing at this glacier. And so, with the internet and word of mouth nowadays, these are the types of things that can basically play a very big role in the safety of others. One of the things that Doug and I did is we ended up going fly fishing on this larger lake, which led into a channel. And so we landed outgoing tributary of this lake in the channel above where the rapids started. And we taxied down towards where the rapids started and then parked the airplane next to this boulder big granite boulder cove tailed in and tied down, and we fished all afternoon. During that time, Doug left because we needed more fuel, and I stayed and I continued fishing. Doug came back with, he went to Nimpo Lake and refueled, came back with a bladder full of fuel, and the tanks topped off. But by then the wind had picked up. It was at least 2 or 3 hours by the time he got back. I was ready to go. So he's like, well, it's your turn to fly the airplane. And up to that point, I'm not even sure I'd flown that airplane before, but I was a very new float plane pilot, as I had said, with 10 hours. And Doug said, I'm going to climb in the back seat. I'm going to put the fuel bladder on my lap. And what you're going to do is you're going to stand in the water and you're going to hold the plane. And you can see if you take the plane and you point it into the wind, how long it takes for it to swing back. And so, the airplane wants to weather vane with the wind. So he's like, you're gonna jump up on the float. You're not even really gonna get in the airplane. You're gonna hit the starter. And as soon as the airplane starts to move, you're gonna climb in. We're gonna back taxi in this channel. And then we're gonna take off into the wind. Well, that was the plan, and the plan did not go as he described it. So I'm standing in the water, and I swing the airplane, and I can kind of see how fast it wants to weather vane back towards me. And so I go a little bit beyond that so that it's kind of pointing into the wind, so it doesn't want to weather vane, it just wants to kind of roll back around. And I climb up on the float, I hit the starter, and the airplane begins to move, and I just get my feet in, and the airplane is now weather vaning. It's actually weather vaning pointing across the channel. And so I decide to add power, some thrust over the rudder and tail feathers. And as soon as I do that, it points even more down the channel. Now Doug's yelling at me, chop the power, pull the mixture. And so I'm yanking the mixture. The airplane is now pointing down the rapids. We're floating towards the rapids. And as the engine comes to a stop, I run out to the end of the float and I jump off the end of the float. And I grab the cable going between the two floats. Now I am looking the opposite direction that we're floating. So I'm looking over my shoulder. I see these rapids coming. I can't touch the bottom. I've got chest waders on, and the chest waders have filled up. And I'm thinking, this was a bad idea. So I'm just thinking, I don't want this airplane to go down these rapids. I don't want to pay for this airplane. Doug doesn't carry insurance, and I figure, now I'm going to have to pay to rebuild this airplane. So I'm just hoping that I can touch bottom at some point and then somehow work my way to shore. So I continue to hang on to the cable, and pretty soon I'm tiptoeing on the bottom. And as we come up towards these rapids, the water is actually starting to move a little faster now. But I have control of the airplane somewhat, and I start to try to maneuver and swing it around. Well, these big granite boulders that were neat places for standing on and fishing are actually taller than the wing of the airplane. So now I'm trying to manipulate the airplane around over the top of some of these boulders without hitting the wing. After what seemed like an eternity, I finally get the airplane back to the spot that I had hit the starter button at. And Doug says, well, you got to get back up on the horse again. And I said, hell no. I said, I'm going to stand here in the water. We're going to put the fuel bladder on the seat. You're going to climb in the airplane. I'm going to hold the airplane for you. As soon as you get it started, I'm going to jump up on the float. I'm going to climb into the back seat. I'm going to put the fuel bladder on my lap, and you're going to fly this airplane out of here. And that's what we did. Well, I know I've said this before. The quickest way to wreck a good airplane is to take an airplane on wheels and hydroplane it on water. Well, I got another one for you. The quickest way to wreck a good airplane is to stick 2 inexperienced float plane pilots in it and send them on their way out into the bush. Unfortunately, I don't have any video or pictures to show you of this incident. I wasn't videotaping it, and the pictures that I had of this place were destroyed when my camera ended up being underwater in my chest waders for so long. Needless to say, this wasn't a confidence builder, and from there on out, I let Doug do all the float plane flying. I couldn't afford to pay for his airplane in the case that I damaged it, and that was always in the back of my mind, so I just couldn't do it. Doug was quick to point out what a He-Man airplane this was. With the 0360 engine, the 90-inch prop pitched to 33, even at 6,000 feet, he could get off the water in probably less than 5 or 6 seconds. And at that altitude, he's down as much as probably 20% in horsepower, so that 180 horse was only putting out about probably 145. He did have quite a bit of wind helping him, so that was definitely a factor in it. I always wondered why float plane insurance was so expensive, and after this trip I understood. At the time, I had a boat and was familiar with how to operate a boat, and I owned an airplane and was familiar with how to operate an airplane. But if you take the two skills and put them together, it doesn't equate to a good pilot. I told you about the one incident. I didn't tell you about the second incident. It wasn't the only incident we had. The next day, we were leaving Mary's Lake, and it was really blowing. All night it had blown really hard, and Doug's airplane was tailed in to the shoreline and had been rocking back and forth in the shoreline. It was pretty well stuck. I said to Doug, before I climbed in the back seat, do you want to get it loose from the shoreline so that you don't have a problem? No, I'll just use the power. I'll just power it off the beach here. I was like, okay. So I'm sitting in the back seat. Doug climbs in, gets strapped in, hits the starter key, warms the airplane up for a little bit. Then he adds the power. And what does it do? The right float comes loose before the left float. It makes a hard 90-degree turn to the left and is headed right for the Stinson that's parked next to us. At this point, Doug reaches for the mixture, pulls the mixture. He runs out to the end of the float. As soon as the prop stops, he jumps off the float. Now he's in the water waist deep, trying to keep his airplane from hitting the Stinson. Fortunately, his airplane sits a little bit higher, and the wing crossed over the top of the Stinson and just barely made contact, leaving no damage. I can't imagine what would have been going through my mind if Doug had talked me into flying the airplane out that day and talked me into just using the power to power it off the beach. I think I would have been done being a float plane pilot for good.
Nice warm.
We didn't fight much weather getting up to Nimpo Lake. In fact, it was just a little bit of a late departure that morning. But coming home was a different story. The day we departed Mary's Lake, the weather had completely changed. By the time we got to Vancouver, BC, we were in fairly marginal conditions, and we landed at Vancouver to set up our customs flight plan and get fuel. We got a thorough weather briefing, and Doug determined that it was flyable. He said, with a float plane, if it gets really bad, we'll just land. We would be over water. The weather in Seattle was reporting clear and visibility 10 miles. So we knew that once we got through that short section of marine air there, that we'd probably be fine. So we took off and we followed the shoreline out of Vancouver, BC, And we stayed low, and the visibility was very low. In fact, at one point, Doug said, "Can you see where we're going?" And I was like, "Yeah, I can see fine." And he said, "Can I borrow your sunglasses?" And I said, "Sure." I was wearing these Maui Jim sunglasses that I wear whenever I'm in low visibility situations. With them, it seems to cut through the fogginess really well. And so I handed them to Doug, and he handed me his sunglasses that he was wearing. And I looked through his sunglasses and I couldn't see anything, and he was happy to have mine. Well, Doug and I managed to make it home safe and sound. This is the end of this adventure, but if you liked what you saw, subscribe.